Okay, we have a lot to get through this year, so I have not done this all in one take. A lot of what I like about this book is how it presents the kind of feminist Japanese perspective. A lot of the times when you see men writing in Japanese literature, especially like Murakami, the women are never really taken into account and they don't really have much character, or they're presented as being almost ultra-feminine. And it's nice to see a book where the women are hardworking, they're blue-collar laborers, and they have their own concerns, and it feels very real, and you get to see a lot of the kind of seedy underbelly of Japanese society. I think the book is quite long, but it doesn't always feel that long. I think it moves at a very good pace, and I would thoroughly recommend it. So I think with Catch-22, I got really bored of the surrealism and kind of irreverence in it for most of it. It felt like way too much of the humor was, he said this? No, he said that. Wait, he said that? No, he said this. And it became extremely repetitive. And I actually quite liked the tone shift when it became much darker by the end and you got to see a lot more of the harrowing aspects of war. And I understand that might not have hit as well without the previous lightheartedness, but I also think that it was much stronger than the lighthearted jokes. So reading both Mr. Norris Changes Trains and Goodbye to Berlin, I think it's the same thing that I felt with Catch-22, is that Mr. Norris Changes Trains is a decently written book, but it does feel very flighty, and it's like, oh, you know, the Nazis are coming into power, but, you know, we're all going to become communist and stop them. Whereas Goodbye to Berlin has that feeling of cynicism in it that makes it feel so much more powerful, especially right at the end where Isherwood's character is talking about how there's this sect of people who they think they're valiant warriors and they're going to defeat the Nazis, but they really don't realize that it's not a game. And Isherwood feels sorriest for them because they don't realize the horror that they've signed themselves up to and the fate that they've consigned themselves to. So the central conceit of Walter Moers' Reise, Durch die Nacht is that it's based off of a series of old, like, woodcut lithographs from an old artist. And they're supposed to, you know, mark out different parts of the story and be, instead of his own illustrations, they serve as the illustrations upon which the story is based. It's decent and it's very much Walter Moers' whimsy style, but the big problem is that it really tries to adhere too much to the, oh, we are basing this off of a series of paintings. Like, every time a new painting shows up, Moers feels like he needs to incorporate every single element. It's like, oh, if there's a woman throwing dice, that has to be in there. If there's an owl somewhere in the painting, that has to be described and have a reason. And it feels like it's bogging down the story and makes it seem like just a bit of a cluster. There's a lot of good stories in The Wandering Earth, and there's a lot of bad stories in The Wandering Earth. I think the problem is that a lot of the stories are a bit too ridiculous, and it feels like things that you would cut out from the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy. Like, oh my god, the dinosaurs are coming back to Earth because they're aliens, they're gonna eat us all. Like, it feels a bit of B-sides cutting room floor. And some of the stories, like Through Her Eyes, are very compelling, but then in the next one, The Tunnel Through the Earth, he'll reference those previous stories that were very compelling and just kind of ruin them. And I feel like this is not Cixin Liu's strongest work. So inside Central Asia, it's an interesting subject matter to me, talking about the various stands, like the history of Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan. The problem with it is I think that he didn't know how to find the interesting aspects of all the history. Some things are interesting, like learning about Uzbekistan's Karamov, but it feels like there's way too many details that could have been cut out. Focusing on Turkey and Iran for large portions where I'm not really as interested in that. I kind of came for the stands. And it ends up being this very long and slow history book that doesn't quite serve to make the area as interesting as it could have been. The central mistake that Frog by Mo Yan makes is that it focuses on the nephew of a woman who is forced to perform abortions for the China's one-child policy, rather than the woman who's performing those abortions. Like, it's a compelling and interesting idea that she, to clear her name, is forced to do these abortions to women who have had a second child. But by focusing on the nephew who only occasionally sees her, I don't care about the life of the nephew. And then, at the end of the book, there's the nephew has written a play that encapsulates the whole plot that we have already just read, this entire book, but again in play form, and it's like 50 pages, and it's just like, I don't care about this. I cared about the woman. I didn't care about the nephew. Why are you making me reread the whole book again, but in a shortened play that is less interesting than the story itself? Petals' Blood is a very interesting book in how it tries to talk about the history of Kenya, the Kenyan spirit, and the struggle it had once it gained independence. The only problem is that a lot of characters will continually wax philosophical about the nature of Kenya. You'll have it where a new character is introduced, like some characters go to meet them, and suddenly that character goes on a long, long monologue about this is the problem with Kenya, this is the problem with Kenyans. And it happens so many times, and the plot is interesting, a lot of the characters are interesting, I like the setting, I like the tone of the story, but continually grinding it to a halt so that these characters can deliver what are really similar monologues. Like, all these characters think exactly the same problems about Kenya. And it kills a lot of the pace of what could have been an otherwise very interesting book. Now, the Best of World Sci-Fi is a compilation, and so you can't judge it too much as a whole. As a whole, it's actually pretty good. And one of the best things about it is that it's made up of authors from all around the world, and so you get unique perspectives. You get some stories that are African influenced, you get some that are Asian influenced, you get some that are from North America, Northern Europe. It's a much wider array of stories than just America or the UK. Specific standout stories to me would be the first and second ones, Immersion and Debtless, as well as other ones such as Fandom for Robots, Benjamin Snyder's Little Greys, and of course, if at first you don't succeed, try again. I really like the Memory Police, and what's interesting about it is that it follows a lot in the Japanese tradition of very poetic and abstract writing. Like if you read anything from Murakami, like the Wind-Up Bird Chronicles, or if you've read Kobo Abe's The Boxman, you're not quite sure if it's literal, if it's figurative, if what you're seeing is actually happening or not. And it's interesting, especially in the case of this book, where the main premise of the story is that every so often you have to forget a common object, like birds. You have to forget that they exist, they all disappear from this mysterious island. And if you can't forget, you're taken away by the police. And of course, this gradually ramps up until you're starting to forget. Well, we won't spoil, because I would actually recommend that you read this book. But it becomes quite disturbing and gruesome by the end, and you're not quite sure how it's supposed to work, but it does. Truth of the Divine is the sequel to Axiom's End. And in many ways you could compare Axiom's End to Cixin Lao's three-body problem. And in that same way, Truth of the Divine actually compares quite well to The Dark Forest, where you've moved away from introductions and explorations of an alien to more of like a political thriller or conspiracy. And it's a similar premise as well, where you start to get all these conflicting plot lines, secrets are being kept, secrets are being revealed, and people are trying to think of legally what should we be doing about the aliens. And as a book, it's very well thought out. It's clear that Lindsay Ellis comes from a very progressive viewpoint, and she's trying to tie in a lot of ideas of kind of America in the Middle East and how Americans tend to other people and not view them as human. And a lot of that relates to how the Americans in this book view the aliens. You can tell that it's trying to learn its lessons from the George Bush era, and it's very inspired by the war in Iraq. And I think overall it works quite well. I like the new characters, Nicola, that's introduced, but you can also, sometimes it feels like I'm watching a Lindsay Ellis video when she talks about, oh yeah, we're going to the Cheesecake Factory. And this is supposed to be the second of 5 books, and so I'm interested to see what the next 3 books would look like, because I don't even know where the plot would continue on from the way this book ends. But overall, it's a very engaging read, it's a very fast read, and if you enjoyed Axiom's End, I would recommend Truth of the Divine. The Republic of False Truths is set in 2011 in Egypt, and it's about the 2011 revolution wherein Hosni Mubarak was deposed. And it's an interesting book in that it's clearly very satirically written. You see early chapters from the perspective of one of the generals who runs the military and is trying to stop the revolution. The authorial voice talks a lot about how the general was always a very good man, you know, while he's also shocking another man in the head with a car battery. And so that satirical, very sarcastic and ironic tone really pervades the entire book, where you see a lot of different sides of protest and revolution. You see an older, richer Coptic man who decides to become part of the revolution. You see a feminist trying to fight for women's rights. And you see a factory worker who's trying to help with unionization, although he is also portrayed as being somewhat clueless as to the effects of the army against his own revolution, and he's kind of portrayed as being self-sacrificing to, you know, an unnecessary point. And it's interesting just to see all those different sides. And it's quite a pessimistic book by the end. You can tell that Alaa al-Aswany is very critical of his country, or at least of the views of the country at that time. So Qualityland by Marc Uwe-Kling is a comedy book. Essentially, I guess the easiest way to describe it would be the dystopian Jeff Bezos Amazon future, where everything's about, you know, what's your social rating, you know, oh, you're not rated high enough to get into this Uber car, so you have to get into this Uber car. Or, you know, drones come in giving you things that you didn't order and that you don't want. And, you know, everything is based on machine algorithms and people are forced to live their lives like that. And I think it's actually quite funny. It's definitely an improvement over his Kangaroo Chronicle series. And I think a lot more of the jokes land, partially because he's not trying as hard to be just absurd and wacky. And he can be a lot more biting in his criticism, whereas I think with the Kangaroo Chronicles, it was always a little toothless when he was... The Silence of Scheherazade is about the city of Smyrna, which is now known as Izmir in Turkey, and it's about the burning of the city. And so for anyone who's not familiar, after World War I, the Greeks decided to invade the city as part of their Megali idea of making a greater Greece, and after several years of occupation, the Turkish forces drove them out, and in the process burnt down the entire city. And as a book, the historical context is very interesting, and I like those parts. I like the rising tension, I like the descriptions of the older city, but the author is so wrapped up in writing this love story, or several love stories between characters, and I just don't care about the love stories. They're not very interesting. It's always this will she, won't she, will they, won't they, and I don't really care. I'm more interested in the history of the city. And the problem is that as the book goes on, it's written in a non-linear way, and so it'll continually flash forward and, you know, to after the city is burnt, and then back to before the city is burnt. But the problem is that in the flash forwards, they constantly go, and this is the night that I was found burnt in the garden of a Turkish family, and it's like, okay, that's cool, but when you finally get to that part in the book, it's not interesting anymore because I've already read about it in 6 different chapters. And I feel like if it had been written in a more chronological, linear fashion, it would work a lot better because you get that rising tension and you're not just thinking, oh, now we're at the scene that's been described 10 times already. The Mountain Sing is an extremely engaging and moving book. It tells kind of a split story. You have the grandmother who lived through the land reform of Vietnam, and the granddaughter who lives through the Vietnam War. And it's interesting that the book is centered in northern Vietnam, near Hanoi City, and it tells the story from the lens of someone living behind communism. I suppose this is my American education, is I had never really known what had led to the Vietnam War in the first place. I didn't know about the split between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. I didn't really know much about the French occupation or the Japanese occupation other than that they had happened. And so it's interesting to see that. It's interesting to learn that historical context, especially seeing how a lot of what happened in Vietnam, such as the land reform, is very similar to what happened in China through its various cultural revolutions. And you get to see another perspective of living in Asia under communism. And I think if you compare this to Frog by Mo Yen, which was also about similar subjects but in China, The Mountain Sing is much more successful because the characters and the focus on the characters is much more engaging. You care about the characters, you care about their struggles, and it feels more lively and alive than Frog, which kind of meandered all about the place. So I would very strongly recommend The Mountain Sing. Well, that's all for this year. We've done a lot of books, we've done a lot of videos. Have you read any of the books in this video? If you did you like them? Tell me in the comments. What else have you been reading this year? And as always, like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, and send me to all your friends.